All right, hello everyone. We are back, and this is your video overview for week 11. I do hope everybody is adjusting to this new reality. I realize that this system is kind of awkward and cumbersome, and it doesn't replace a live class, but it's what we have at the moment. So I do hope that it is providing the semblance of a classroom experience. To begin, you've got your thematic essay, which is due Monday of this week, March 30th. If you don't make that deadline exactly, that's okay, but obviously you want to turn in the assignment sooner rather than later, so please do submit it to the Dropbox, which you should find under the Dropbox link. I think I've also put a link to that on the content page under week 11. The other thing I wanted to run by you, and again, I'm staring at my notes here, is if you think a Zoom conference would be helpful, please let me know via email. This is a means that MTSU has recently acquired to create a virtual classroom space. And it's something that we can look at and explore and consider. If you really feel a need to do something like this, have a virtual class or a virtual Q&A setup, we can certainly arrange for that. It might take me a little while to figure out the technology, but just let me know. Right now I'm thinking April 3rd or April 6th. If I hear early in the week that there's a real strong demand for it, I will let you know one way or another. Okay, so, and one final thing, I realized at the beginning that I said these video introductions are going to take 6 to 8 minutes. I'm still going to shoot for that, but they seem to be running a little bit longer than that. I apologize for that, but I will do my best to keep things condensed and let the course content speak for itself. So anyways, our readings for this week are David Hume, whose work begins on page 219, and if you look at the overview there, you should find some good introductory information. And then the reading on the syllabus is pages 226 to 231. And Hume is often paired with John Locke, and just to review, John Locke had an investment in the ideas of empiricism, or realities founded on sense experience, and epistemology, the idea that knowledge comes from a particular source, and for Locke, the source of knowledge was based in sense experience. Another idea we associate Locke is with the concept of the human mind as what's called a tabula rasa, a blank board or a blank table, and experiences shape the reality of that tabula rasa. As we live in the world and come to understand senses and come to trust our senses, that's what shapes our reality. So obviously, with respect to scientific inquiry, those concepts are very relevant. Now, Locke contrasts significantly with a later philosopher, David Hume. Again, his first introduction is on page 219, but the reading is on page 226. And Hume stands for a different idea of knowledge and its origins. And for Hume, the matter of emotion factors much more heavily into our understanding of the world. You've got a couple of excellent resources that explain Hume. First of all, a brief introduction, and I've left the introduction to John Locke there so you can compare the two. But Lockean empiricism and David Hume's manner of induction or system of induction, these are often principles that are often contrasted. So that's worth a look just to understand where Hume sits in regard to our understanding of how we begin to construct facts out of the world. So those are some useful resources that are designed to supplement the readings and provide a fuller picture of David Hume's contributions to the philosophy of science. The interesting implication to this is that we think of science as and this is a modern conception, we think of science as a cut and dried fact. And what Hume suggests to us is that emotion is not absent from science. Our emotional state is so deep and so fundamental to our personality that it can shape what we want to see. It can shape how we experience, uh, how we interpret events, and uh, how we make sense of our sense experience and so forth. So that's another important component that we would we would do well to take note of. So, anyways, that's the first reading. The second is in the starts on page 238. It's called Methodology and Revolution, and kind of looks ahead to a transition from week 11 to week 12. And the way I've characterized this transition in the past is the idea of philosophers doing natural philosophy, which is pretty much what we have through Bacon into the beginnings of the Royal Society and the key figures there, Boyle and Newton and Robert Hooke and some of the others. Even though they are early scientists, they thought of themselves as natural philosophers. And so that was how they understood their work. And moving forward, we see a growing idea of scientists doing science as we understand the term. And the reading mentions some of the names and omits others. But next week, or I'm sorry, not next week, but our other figure for this week, Joseph Banks, he actually represents a beginning point and a means for us to trace an intellectual and scientific lineage. We'll get into Banks in just a moment, but Banks actually went out and lived and did science. He did an early form of anthropology. And we can draw a fairly evident line from Banks to William Herschel to Georges Cuvier and Charles Lyell, the early pioneering geologist who we'll read next week. And then once we get into Alexander von Humboldt, who is a lot of different things, a naturalist and a biologist and a geologist and all manner of other things, a geoscientist, I suppose. And then from von Humboldt to Darwin, we can see a definite line unfolding. Okay, so that brings us to Joseph Banks, and I've given you a number of resources that accompany the reading by Richard Holmes called The Age of Wonder. For starters, there's some information about Captain James Cook, who was the great British naval captain who Banks worked in conjunction with, and the reading describes their often tumultuous and complicated relationship, but it points to this idea of colonialism and science proceeding hand in hand. So colonizing, military expansion, and scientific endeavor. These are all enabled by or captured in the relationship between Banks and James Cook. Holmes's book, The Age of Wonder, talks about the romance of science, the thrill of scientific discovery as a new form of dark art and a means of seeing the world up close in new ways. A section that he talks about that I didn't assign deals with the first generation of so-called aeronauts, daring young men who would go up in hot air balloons and see the world from above in ways that no human had seen it before. And so that's an interesting illustration, but just the imagination, the way that new vision worked on the imagination. Holmes talks about some paintings by Joseph Wright, which I've listed on your note page, a number of images that are worth Googling just to see how they capture this romantic idea of science. And then Banks himself, a couple of key things about him. Again, I mentioned he's really an early version of an anthropologist. He went out, assisted by Cook and the British Navy, and lived in the place we now refer to as Tahiti, but it's got a much more native sounding name, Otaheite, which I probably just mispronounced. But uh, this experience, and then Banks returning to London and to his aristocratic circles, um, really was a captivating one and made him into an instant celebrity. And ultimately brought him the kind of fame that resulted in his appointment to the chair of the Royal Society. So that institution stays with us. And in a subsequent voyage that Banks wasn't on, the expedition encouraged a native Tahitian named Omai to come to London, and he became Banks's friend, and their relationship was very, very hard to qualify. But there's an excellent uh, description in the reading of that relationship between Banks, his assistant Daniel Solander, and Omai. On page 51, pages 46 to 54 detail Banks's endeavors to work with the Royal Navy and his explorations on their own. And I've also given you some Google pages, a couple of people working in Banks's exhibition, or Banks's expedition in Tahiti, were named Sidney Parkinson and Alexander Buchan, and they were both illustrators who sought to portray that culture to interested Europeans. So, a number of things are there. Let me make sure I've got everything, but I think between the introduction, the documentaries, and the images you have accessible and available through Google, you'll have a lot to see there. So those are some features or some details about the week's readings. Again, let me know if you want me to schedule a Zoom conference for the class, just so we can touch base in a real-time environment. If we don't need to, that's fine, but that might help us, and again, it'll give me a chance to practice with that new technology. So anyways, thanks for listening, and I hope this information is helpful. Have a good week.